Energy Futures Group on behalf of the Climate Council via the Agency of Natural Resources and the Department of Public Service. And then we will go on to an update and a proposal from the Transportation Task Group around how to move forward in the transportation sector. We have 2 designated times for public comment. Actually, looks like the online agenda at 1 o'clock has one time for, oh, yes, we do have 2 times. One at 1 o'clock on the thermal sector. We'll try and stick to that as closely as possible. And then another time for public comment. It's not explicitly called out, but it is in the agenda in the Transportation Task Group update. It would be important to get public comment on that issue as well. Any comments on the agenda? Hearing none, we'll go on to the minutes from the 10/26 meeting. Those are linked in the agenda, and does anybody have any comment on those? I'm going to take that as a no, and we'll deem the minutes approved. If you haven't had a chance to look at them and you find issues, please let us know, and we can take it up again. So with that, want to move quickly because we have kind of we have a really packed agenda today, and want to really turn it over to David Hill and Liz Bourget from Energy Futures Group to present the results of their analysis of the thermal sector policies and options to meet our thermal sector requirements, including a clean heat standard, expanding existing programs, and other policy options. Just really briefly, this has been kind of a long project. There's a lot of information, a lot of data. I think the slideshow is going to be, the slides are going to be challenging to get through them all. So I'll urge at the beginning, I think, clarifying questions so that David and Liz can get through, and then leave. Hopefully we have about 25 minutes or a half hour for comment and discussion. With that, unless Brian, you wanted to say any opening words, you know, about the process. Well, I'm seeing you shake your head no. Good. And then I can turn it directly over to David and Liz. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, DJ. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Great, thank you. Thank you, TJ, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for having us today. We're happy to join you to present the work that our team has been working on for this past year on the analysis of buildings' thermal energy sector emissions reductions policies for Vermont. And before we start, we just wanted to quickly acknowledge the state's project management team from ANR and from PSD, and to thank them for their management throughout the project. And we want to thank them as well as the Buildings and Thermal Task Group for their review and feedback on the project materials throughout the project. So let's get started. So let's start with a review of today's presentation. Like TJ mentioned, we'll try to keep the presentation to 30 minutes and leave 25 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. So yes, it would be helpful if you could leave discussion questions for the end of the presentation. So we'll start diving right into key findings from the analysis. Then we'll review with you the objectives and the approach of our study. We'll review emissions results and societal benefits and costs. And then we'll go a little bit deeper into the objectives and the takeaways from each of complementary models. We'll leave you with a few conclusions, and then, yes, we'll leave time for discussion and questions. Before we start, we wanted to do a quick introduction to our team. So the project team consisted of Energy Futures Group, EFG, Stockholm Environment Institute, SEI, and Cadmus. I'm Liz Bourget, and at today's meeting we have David Hill and Chris Nemi from EFG. We have Taylor Bennington from SEI and Jason Christensen from Cadmus. So again, thanks for having us to present our analysis and our findings today. And I'm going to turn it over to David to start off with some key findings from our report.
Great. Thank you, Liz, and thank you everybody for joining us. We look forward to presenting the results today and having discussion with you, and we appreciate, as Liz said, the contributions from others that we've had over the course of this study. So the first thing I want to do is just provide a quick overview of, as a reminder, this group is relatively familiar, I think, with the pathway study and other things that we've done, but this continues to build on that work, and just a quick overview of the scenarios, which will be important as we present the results. The business as usual scenario, this project involved an update to that. We presented to this committee and to the cross-sector subcommittee and the task force on this earlier. But the updated baseline includes things like the IRA, the Investment and Infrastructure Act, Act 125 or 185 in Vermont, clean cars and clean trucks. So the business as usual update does reduce emissions, expected emissions, and so that makes the gap between the requirements and the expected emissions under the business as usual less than they were in the previous pathways analysis. The other scenarios then that we've, and I'll share a little bit more about that on a subsequent slide here. The other scenarios that we've analyzed, the second scenario is meets the economy-wide emissions requirements by 2030. And so within that, there are three policy sets: expansion of existing programs and initiatives. 2B, the second one is the clean heat standard. And then a third is a cap and invest type approach. The 20th scenario number 3 has the RCI sector meeting the proportional requirements by 2030. And so this is an important distinction. If the RCI sector meets the proportional requirements, but we didn't model additional changes from other sectors, then the economy-wide emissions requirements by 2030 are not met. So in a sense, scenario 3 has the RCI sector over complying, but the economy-wide requirements by 2030 are met. The same three policy sets, the clean heat standard, expansion of existing programs and initiatives, and then a cap and invest are also analyzed within the scenario 3 set. And then the fourth scenario is regulatory mechanisms and regulatory bundles, more of a kind of a scenario based on compliance and enforcement of emissions limits on individual emitters, performance standards for buildings, those types of things, with less emphasis on incentives to reach those. And so that scenario has a higher level of participation in emissions reductions from commercial and industrial customers, assuming that that type of an approach where you're directly regulating emissions would be easier to implement, more reasonable to implement that with a smaller number of larger emitters than across the entire residential base of households. Next slide, Liz. So there are about 6 slides on key findings, so I'll go through these relatively quickly. This slide 6, illustrates the change, as I was mentioning, with the business as usual. The solid bars represent the old business as usual case from the pathways analysis. And what we see here in the revised business as usual update, emissions are about 16% lower than they were in the previous baseline in 2025 and about 26% lower by 2030. So this does have a significant impact in terms of meeting the requirements for 2030, and then again for 2050. It makes it easier, but there still are there will be additional initiatives and policy actions taken beyond the business as usual to meet the GWSA requirements, both for the RCI sector and for the economy-wide. Next slide. Slide number 7 summarizes in a fashion that we've used before the societal benefits and costs. As a reminder to folks, the thermal analysis, the objectives of this study were to look from a number of different perspectives, including the societal perspective, the program cost and administrative perspective, perspectives from customer economics, and those are all slightly different in terms of the economic analysis that's conducted to calculate those. But this looks, these are results from the LEAP model on the societal perspective, and what we have above the 0 line, kind of in the middle there, the top green and blue portions of these bars are avoided fuel consumption, and then the avoided social, economic, and environmental damages. All of these are through across the study horizon and are on a discounted basis using a 2% discount rate. And so those benefits on the top are offset by the additional investments, which are below the 0 line, and the different categories with the different colored bars there represent the additional investments, again, over the course of the entire analysis period. And those represent the additional investments in each of the scenarios. We've adjusted these to incorporate end effects for measures that are implemented towards the end of the analysis period, and so therefore have the costs of those measures fully represented, but the benefits going forward, if they have a longer lifetime, say a weatherization job that's done towards the end of the analysis period, we did an exogenous to the LEAP calculation adjustment for the end effects to capture those. What these results show is across the 3 scenarios, we have a range of these show additional costs, additional net costs over the analysis period, ranging from $568 million for the regulatory bundle up to $1.485 billion for the scenario 3, the RCI proportional requirements. So those represent additional costs to Vermont's energy economy, if you would, to Vermont's economy over the course of the period. Those in this, across that time span, in relation to Vermont's spending, energy expenditures in that period, that would be an increase on the order of this 0.9 to 2.36%. So a relatively small additional expenditure. Now, an important point on this graphic is that the top blue bar, the avoided social and economic environmental damages, are based on the values that were used in the pathways analysis for the social cost of carbon. The Climate Council reviewed those, and those are at about 122. They started at $122 per ton, an increase over the course of the analysis. There is recent analysis from Resources for the Future, and the federal government has put out guidelines for a higher social cost of carbon. If we took the higher social cost of carbon, it would increase these values by roughly $4 billion. And so all of the scenarios would have a positive benefit cost ratio, were a higher value for the social cost of carbon adopted and used in this study. Next slide, please, Liz. This slide represents the additional costs above the baseline for the different programmatic scenarios. And what we see is that, as I mentioned before, the baseline makes the gap to meet the requirements less, but there's still programmatic initiatives will be required to have the adoption of measures reflected in the scenarios. And so the increased programmatic and administrative expenses, this would include the costs for program measures as well as administration and oversight of the program initiatives started about in a range of $11 to $28 million above the business as usual in 2024. Those increased to the 30 to 50 million above business as usual by 2030, and then increased rather steeply after that, 130 to 200 million above the business as usual by 2050. A lot of that is towards the end. To continue reducing emissions, there is the need to use higher shares of biofuels to replace the existing remaining fossil fuels. And so the upturn in those incentive or the program costs after the 2035 partially reflects that. Next slide, please. Another key finding from the customer economic perspective, there are two slides here that try to highlight the customer economic perspectives. Here, what we see is the cases that have the bars below the horizontal zero line. This shows the net change in annual cost for a low-income single-family household participating in 2025. The bars below the zero line indicate that a household adopting emissions reductions measures, in this case, the heat pumps or heat pump water heater, a central heat pump or two-headed water heater, two-headed air source heat pump or a heat pump water heater would all be expected to be saving annual energy costs on in most cases. The fossil gas, because the gas prices are less in comparison to propane and fuel oil, have an increased annual cost. But for many consumers, and particularly given that the incentives for low and moderate income consumers are anticipated to be required to be in the 75% to 100% range to encourage the participation, these consumers will be saving annual energy costs. Next slide. Recovery of the costs for the programs is anticipated to come in the form of surcharges for fuel or charges that are put into place to recover costs for implementing initiatives by fuel providers. And so there's our analysis, the work that Jason with the Cadmus group did, helped us look at the potential impact based on the program cost profiles that we just looked at, as well as the annual energy consumption in each of the scenarios. Lets us calculate the additional estimated cost increases for different fuel types. What we see is that natural gas fuel prices, the rates for natural gas were estimated to increase by roughly 50% by 2034. Those are somewhat higher than the propane and fuel oil cost increases, largely due to the cost increase being for the natural gas having a higher fixed cost price and the fuel oil and propane not having the fixed cost recovery issues. But this chart illustrates for residential heating oil, by the policy in the scenario, the additional costs estimated are the orange bars on top of that, the additional dollars per gallon estimated. Electricity rates also were calculated. There is an increase in electric consumption as end uses are electrified, as we might expect. But there are additional costs for meeting the scenarios associated with generation and capacity. But as the volumes of electricity increase, the impact on rates is negligible, and so the impact on rates, electric rates, is less noticeable than for the fossil fuels. And the program costs are being recovered from the fossil fuel components as well. Next slide. This is the last one. So a summary table, kind of, if you would, of the key findings, the societal perspectives, again, showing the regulatory bundle potentially with the lowest level of additional costs, again, assuming that we are using this is based on the social cost of carbon value at 100, starting at 122, but the societal costs, additional net societal costs of 568 to $1.485 billion over the course of the study period. A focus here on the 2024 to 2030 program and administrative costs. These are the total costs. These have no amortization. The earlier slide showed some amortization of the program costs, but these then illustrate the costs estimated over the 2024 to 2030 period. And then from the customer's perspective, the increases with residential fuel oil price impacts in 2025 and 2030. So that's a quick summary. There is a lot of information, additional information in our report, but that's a highlight of the key findings. And then we'll go a little bit more into the analysis, our approach, and a bit more detail through the rest of the presentation. So Liz?
Sure. Thanks, David. So right now you've heard some key takeaways from our analysis. We want to take a step back, review with you the objectives of the study, and a bit on our approach. So our analysis is intended to help inform decision-making at the state to guide future policy decisions. Our team identified and assessed policies available to the state to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the building's thermal sector. And this was in an effort to assess policies necessary to meet the building sector's proportional share of emission reduction requirements of the GWSA. So the analysis included an assessment of the costs, benefits, and greenhouse gas emission reductions of the policies across multiple criteria and from several different perspectives. The analysis considers social, programmatic, and administrative costs of the policies relative to the business as usual case. And it also includes an assessment of the impact on Vermont households with a particular consideration of the impact on low and moderate income households, as well as contributions and impacts from federal support. So some background on our approach. We started with a qualitative assessment of the various policy options available. And from this qualitative assessment, we worked with A&R and PSD to come up with the policy sets, which David just described earlier and which were used in our analysis. The next step was to update the business as usual or BAU scenario. This is a forecast of energy system costs and emissions absent any new state climate policies. And we developed a baseline for the previous analysis, the Vermont Pathways report David mentioned, and now we updated it to reflect a few new updates, so to reflect new federal and state investments, as well as updates to historical data, technology assumptions, and projections based on updated trends. So the next step in the analysis was the quantitative modeling. So this involved 4 different models, some of which we developed for this analysis. The graphic on the right illustrates how these models fit together and inform one another. And the quantitative analysis involved how they're interconnected. So the graphic shows how the qualitative assessment and the baseline revisions informed the low emissions analysis platform, so the LEAP model. And then the policy scenarios were developed in the LEAP model. And then we used the workbooks outside of LEAP to estimate program and admin costs, customer economics, and rate and fuel price impacts of the different policy scenarios. So you can see, like, for example, the incentives from the program and admin cost workbook inform the customer economics workbook, while the outputs from the rate and fuel price impacts workbook were used as inputs into the customer economics workbook. So the analysis started with a consideration of the emissions reductions, both economy-wide and specifically for the RCI sector, and how these related to the requirements of the GWSA. So this graph just displays the RCI sector emissions by year and by scenario. So it's in 1,000 metric tons of CO2e in the individual years you see, and each individual bar within the 4 time periods are the scenarios. So on the far left is the business as usual or baseline scenario, which does not meet the GWSA requirements in 2030 or in 2050. But then you can see that the second scenario, the 2030 economy-wide GWSA requirement scenario, the RCI sector provides more emissions reductions than the proportional scenario reduction would in order to meet the economy-wide requirement. The third scenario, the RCI proportional scenario, meets the sector proportional requirements in 2030 and 2050, but does not necessarily meet the economy-wide requirements on its own in 2030. And the regulatory bundle scenario, the fourth one there, also meets the GWSA requirements in 2030 and in 2050. Okay, a lot to take in, but I will now hand it over back to David to review societal benefits and costs.
Thank you, Liz. So slide 18 again shows the summary at the societal benefit cost results, ranging from the 568 million additional costs for the regulatory bundle to 1.485 for the RCI proportional requirement scenario, scenario 3. Scenario 2 is in between those. We also conducted a sensitivity analysis for this that was on the next slide. We see slide 19 is a high oil price sensitivity. And the change for this is just then comparing the RCI proportional requirement scenario to the baseline without high oil prices, to, on the right, the high oil compared to the baseline with high oil prices. And we see just a slight increase in the total costs associated with that. And what happens is that there is a increase in the green in terms of the avoided fuel consumption costs, but there are also some slightly higher on the electric generation side, some slightly higher costs in the high oil case. And therefore, and that's not just necessarily associated with oil costs for electric generation, but the electric generation sector in general has a slightly higher cost there. And so those mostly offset the additional benefits from the higher value of the avoided fuels. Again, these are with the same social cost of carbon value that was used in the pathways analysis. So moving along, we
David, sorry, I do have one clarifying question. When you introduced these two slides, the package, you said societal benefit slides, but really these measures under the current values used for the societal cost test are the takeaway here is that they're not cost effective under the societal test. And so it's either a net benefit or it's really a net cost, right? So these measures are not cost effective. Is that right?
We're not the scenario. We're not conducting strictly a cost benefit test, but we are characterizing. You're right. The total costs on these and with the valuation of the social cost of carbon, the net present value of the costs is greater than the net present value of the avoided fuel costs and the avoided social and economic damages.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Jared, did you have a clarifying question?
Yeah, I just think it's really important to pause on that, because while I appreciate that there were a number of updates in this analysis from what was done in 2020 to use more recent data that was available, over the last 3 years, including updated fossil fuel prices, analysis of fossil fuel displacement from heat pumps, etc. I don't think what you just said TJ is accurate, because you were saying a current social cost of carbon. This analysis is using a dated, older social cost of carbon from 2020. And if we were using the current figures that have come out from RFF and from the EPA, which are not $122 a ton, in 2020, but are in the range of $185 to $190 a ton. What I heard you saying, David, is if you had been using those more current numbers, then in every scenario, we would see a net societal benefit using those more current and accurate social cost of carbon figures that the federal government has developed. And I would note that when we adopted the social cost of carbon as a climate council in 2020, it was using the RFF number that has since been updated. And we said that when the federal number came out, that is what we should use. So I have to say, I appreciate that you noted that, David. I have to say, I'm disappointed that in the report, that sensitivity was not added. We don't have a graph showing that. I appreciate that you verbally mentioned that if we use that higher social cost of carbon value, that is the more current and appropriate value, it would increase the net societal benefits by $4 billion and lead to net positive societal benefits in every scenario modeled. I think that's a very important point, so that we don't get left with the takeaway that TJ just summarized.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Jared, because my recollection may be incorrect, was that, and what I meant was the currently used by the council, and maybe that is what is incorrect, because I thought that the Science and Data Committee needed to actually make a recommendation to use something different, and maybe that doesn't need to happen, but we could take that offline and should carry forward. I think the difference here is that, in the pathways report, for instance, everything, even under using the 2% discount rate, was wholly societally cost effective. And here, so even going more, changing that would make it more cost effective. And here it really kind of changes the sign, what you decide on that. And so I think it is an important point to get right. But we should probably save that discussion. And sorry to take up some of your time, David.
That's okay. These are important questions, and yes, that value and the change in that value does have a significant impact on the total results. The next section, we go through in a little bit more detail the complementary models, starting with the customer economics model, and then the program and admin costs and fuel and rate impacts. And so I'll turn it back to Liz to start with the customer economics.
Cool, thanks. So yeah, let's just dive right in. The objective of the workbook was to compare the costs of implementing a decarbonization measure to the costs of staying on fossil fuels for a Vermont household. So, for example, this means we are comparing the costs or savings of a household utilizing fossil fuels to one using a decarb measure within a specific policy, for example, the Clean Heat Standard. So the fossil fuels included were propane, fuel oil, and natural gas. The decarb measures included were electrification measures, so like a switch to a heat pump or a heat pump water heater, biofuel measures including biofuels, RNG, wood stoves, and pellet boilers, and as well weatherization. And like we mentioned earlier, but it's important to say that this workbook was informed by other parts of the analysis. So the incentives, for example, from the LMI for LMI households are aligned with the program and admin cost workbook, and the rates and fuel prices are aligned with the rate and fuel price impacts workbook, both of which are covered just a little later. And we'll highlight a few key takeaways right up front. So first, the importance of incentives to LMI households. The incentives in the analysis across all of the workbooks were a 100% incentive for low-income households, so meaning it covers the full capital cost of a measure, and 75% incentive for moderate income households. These incentives were important in allowing LMI households to implement a decarb measure and to realize reduced household energy costs. In addition, the results across the scenarios showed that a switch from propane or fuel oil to a decarb measure is often economical for customers, but that we're also noting that market rate incentives to switch from fossil gas to a decarb measure may need to be higher than those for propane and fuel oil to encourage that switch. So just some results. The workbook captures results for 2 snapshots in time, 2025 and 2030, as well as lifetime costs or savings. The analysis distinguishes costs for low income, moderate income, and market rate customers, and for single family and multifamily buildings. The tables we're looking at now show the change in annual costs in a clean heat standard policy in the 3 scenarios. So the RCI proportional scenario. Green is negative costs, aka savings, and red is costs. And so, for example, the table shows that a single family low-income household within this clean heat standard policy, switching from a propane furnace to an air source heat pump is estimated to save about $1,573 in 2025. And again, this is only one value of 1 year's worth of savings in 2025 for a measure that will obviously likely last many years. And so you can see just in these snapshots that many of these decarb measures result in savings when switching from propane and from fuel oil. But this reinforces the earlier point about the potential importance of incentives to switch away from fossil gas. So these are annual costs. On the next slide, we have the lifetime costs of each measure in an example scenario. And again, it's the clean heat standard scenario policy within the RCI proportional reduction scenario. And again, in 2025. So a negative cost means that a household saves money in the policy scenario for the decarb measure, and a positive cost means that there is a cost to switch to the decarb measure. So like for annual costs, for many of the decarb measures in this scenario, there are savings for households using propane and fuel oil. And like the analysis of the annual cost, there are some measures which have a lifetime cost when switching from fossil gas to a decarb measure, which again indicates the potential importance of incentives to switch from fossil gas to a decarb measure. I see a hand. Christine.
I should remember this from reviewing the report, but I'm having a brain freeze. Are these customer economics results done assuming no incentive?
No, so the incentive is 100% incentive capital costs for a low income household and 75% incentive for capital costs for moderate income.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that was it, just high level results from customer economics workbook, and I will pass it to David to walk through the program and admin costs workbook.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, so very quickly, again, the program and admin cost model, the objectives were to document and estimate the programmatic costs, so including direct measure incentives, technical support, marketing, development, program administration, support services, those types of things, as well as state administrative costs for the different policy initiatives, reflecting the adoption of the measures required to meet the consistent with the scenarios. So the levels of weatherization or heat pump adoption or other measures adopted in the scenarios. And so the adoption profiles and costs by both measures and measure groups are reflected, as well as the program and administrative costs. as we said before, the business as usual update, reflecting the IRA, et cetera, reduces the gap between 2030 business as usual and the 2030 requirements for the GWSA, but there would be additional programmatic initiatives required. And incentive support for, as Liz was just saying, incentive support for the moderate and lower income households below 120% of the state median. We're assuming that those are necessary to promote the adoption of these measures so that people aren't going to be adopting the measures without the incentives, and to have the favorable economic results for their households, the incentives are required. But there are benefits associated with that, obviously, for providing support for those households to transition to the clean energy and then to have lower energy costs going forward. The delivery of all of these services, I think it's important to note that, Vermont has, there's a lot of challenges in terms of ramping up the delivery of services and the services to provide all these, but I think Vermont is building on a strong foundation of program, initiatives and service delivery in the energy sector. And so that's an important benefit for the state to work off of. And the program and administrative costs, the estimates of those costs continue to rise as you go out into the future. We focus more on the near term, the coming decade up to 2030, 2034 as most important, but it's reasonable to anticipate that continued program and administrative costs would continue through the time period, and that's what our results represent. So slide 25 is I'm going to go, we've seen this and kind of talked through again. So I'm not going to repeat the information. This just, again, gives these are the amortized costs. We're assuming that there would be some amortization of program costs associated with running the initiatives. And that these then are recovered, and those feed into the costs for the rate impacts that are estimated in the CADMIS analysis. The state administrative costs, going to slide 26, this is not the program administrator, but this is kind of more from the state perspective. So we looked at program costs both to distinguish between program administration and the state costs. The regulatory bundle, which is the yellow line in this graphic, which recall had the lower overall societal cost, would be estimated to have a higher level of cost for state administration for compliance and enforcement activities. And so that tends to be higher than the other initiatives, which are based more on provision of incentives and supports for transition. But again, the state admin costs in terms of the overall level of costs here are a much smaller portion. These are in the orders of single digits to 10 to 18 million for the state admin costs. So those are anticipated to grow, and they're highest for the regulatory bundle. We also think, just qualitatively, as development of policies goes forward, consideration of the viability and the acceptability of using kind of more of a, if you would, a command control regulatory model to limit emissions, or have penalties or performance standards for emissions directly, as opposed to an incentive-based system, is worthy of consideration. Going
David,
to
just
the
a
next...
couple, sorry to rush you, but just a couple minutes more. I think you're
Okay,
getting close to the end, but
we are getting close. The rate and fuel. So if you go to slide 27, Liz, we've discussed this, the rate and fuel price workbook. The recovery of costs associated with the additional program costs are anticipated to be placed onto fuel prices, as surcharges. And so the analysis took the program costs that we've looked at, and then the volumes of these fuels that would be consumed, and, as we said, then calculated the estimated increases to prices Gas prices on the key takeaways, gas price increase was estimated to be higher than it would be for propane and heating oil. Electric rates show relatively little impact. And the price impacts for oil and propane are kind of within historic volatility levels. If we move to slide 29, that shows again, this is the this shows in the different time periods, again, the additional estimated gallons, dollars per gallon on top of the residential heating oil prices. And these prices are within kind of historical volatility type levels. So we have a few slides on, we have just 2 more slides on conclusions. So I'll turn it back to Liz, and then we can open it up for discussion and questions.
Sure. Yeah, I think we had an ambitious amount of detail to get through today. So I'll just go through really quickly that, like we said at the beginning, the analysis was intended to help support decision makers. And it's important to keep in mind that the modeling and results are not prescriptive or predictive, meaning that the scenarios modeled are not necessarily what will happen, or that they do not necessarily lay out the one path forward to meeting the GWSA requirements. The results show that there are multiple policy options that can meet the requirements, and that for each of the policy sets, there are multiple mixes of measures that can meet the requirements, meaning that there isn't necessarily like one exact number of heat pumps installed or houses weatherized that will be the one answer for the state to meet the GWSA requirements. And these are all things you've just heard. Just going to emphasize the last 2 points, which relate to the importance of considering equity in policy design. We think that if equity is considered in policy design, meeting the GWSA requirements can mean significant positive benefits for LMI customers that adopt decarb measures, and that this is an opportunity to address equity impacts of energy use in the state. So I'll leave it there, and let's open it up for questions and discussion.
Jared, go ahead. Thank you, Liz and David, for that summary and recognizing that it was rushed. I hope folks take time to take a look at the slides in more detail in the report. But thank you for breezing through that. I know that can be challenging. Jared, go ahead.
Yeah, just an incredible amount of work. Thank you so much for all of the information and analysis you compiled. There is a lot of really important and quality things that are worth spending time with, carefully reading the report. I do want to say that and I appreciate, we've already covered the net societal costs or benefits question, so I won't dwell on that. But there is another assumption in the report that I have a significant concern about and want to ask a question about. And that is that, on page 61, the report notes that the modeling and analysis reflects participation that is proportional to population demographics. And then later it says that includes things like demographics includes fuel use type. And one result of that assumption, which I don't believe is realistic, is that gas customers would be served with and likely to adopt clean heat measures at the same rate as fuel oil or propane customers. And however, given the greater emissions reductions achieved from and the greater cost savings achieved when delivering clean heat options to fuel oil and propane customers versus gas customers in Vermont, I think it's highly likely that fuel oil and propane customers will actually be served at a higher degree than would gas customers, given the kind of market design of the clean heat standard, where obligated parties, even if they're a gas utility, for instance, can earn clean heat credits by reducing emissions for fuel oil or for propane customers and vice versa. And I think that there are market reasons. Obligated parties are going to seek the lowest cost clean heat credits. And there's customer choice reasons, right? Customers are going to want to do the clean heat activities that are likely to save them the most money. And that's going to be more true for fuel oil and propane customers than it is for gas customers. And I just think that it's important to note that if we didn't have this kind of proportional by fuel use assumption, that the projected savings, specifically from a clean heat standard, would go up, and the projected cost of compliance to the clean heat standard would go down. And I really hesitate with that assumption, given how the clean heat standard is actually designed and what we know about those market dynamics and those customer cost realities that you did such a good job of highlighting in your customer economics workbooks. So that's kind of the main concern that I have in terms of inputs and assumptions and what it means for some of the takeaways. I'll also just comment that, I think that given the language of the Affordable Heat Act, 3B is clearly, to me, the clean heat standard scenario to assess or to look at in the tables, not 2B. And the reason I say that is because Act 18, the Affordable Heat Act, in 8122A states that the clean heat standard shall meet the thermal sector portion of greenhouse gas emission reduction obligations of the Global Warming Solutions Act. It doesn't speak of the RCI or thermal sector overperforming to meet economy-wide reductions as the 2B modeling does. And so I think then when you look at 3B, and you talk about fuel price impacts, what you see in your table is only a 1 cent increase in the first year of the Clean Heat Standard program in 2025 projected for fuel oil, and a cumulative total of a 12-cent increase between now and 2030 over 7 years of activity. And I think what your report does a really good job at making clear is the link between those price effects and between the ability to provide incentives for low and moderate income Vermonters to achieve those energy savings. So, I think it is really important, that if we want to say on the one hand that low and moderate income households should be served with very high incentives from an equity perspective to help them move away from high cost and price volatile fossil fuels, the only way that happens is with revenue to provide those incentives, which is what leads to the price increases on the fossil fuel side. So those things are interlinked. And I think it's hard to separate them. And I think you did a good job at drawing that linkage. But I do want to just go back and say that I do have this concern around that the clean heat activity, the market activity is going to happen proportionally to existing fuel use. I think the design of the policy, the way markets work and what we know about customer economics, that's very unlikely to be true.
I'm not so sure. I'm just going to jump in and respond because I think Vermont Gas is an obligated entity under the Clean Heat Standard, and I think it is much more likely that they will be pursuing measures for their own customers rather than for other customers. Now, right now, the Public Utility Commission has actually ruled that they cannot actually do measures like they proposed a ground source heat pump in Rutland, not in their service territory, that would have avoided propane. And the commission ruled that they cannot do that. And so unless that type of thing changes, then which would need either a change in PUC position, which could happen, or a statutory change, then I think that I don't know exactly, maybe it's more biofuels and less heat pumps or whatever it is, but I think some measures are going to happen with Vermont Gas customers at some cost. So I don't want to rule that out completely. And, I don't know where the weight lands on likely or not likely, but I don't think it's so easy to say one way or the other.
I think those are both excellent points, and the analysis didn't capture, say, the more targeted delivery as such. For the modeling perspective and for the LEAP modeling perspective, we needed to have something like the proportional to the demographic and the fuel use assumptions in there. But both points are important. I think important to keep in mind that is what the modeling is based on, is more the proportional as opposed to more targeted, and the targeted could be beneficial.
David, this is Chris. Could I just add a little bit more to what
Sure.
you just said? When you're doing a modeling exercise like this, by definition, to actually make the modeling manageable, you have to look at average conditions and assume the average household, the average business, the average cost of treating a house and treating a business, et cetera. We do this all the time in forecasting efficiency programs, impacts, and the like. There's probably some inherent conservatism associated with using averages, that when implementers are actually going about getting the savings or the emission reductions or whatever that they are obligated to get, they don't have to work exactly with averages, at least not all the time. So there may be some opportunities for economies for more strategic targeting, even if it's within the propane or fuel oil or natural gas sectors themselves, let alone kind of across sectors. It's really difficult to estimate what the magnitude of that potential economy might be, though. And it's probably not enormous, but it's also probably not zero.
Christine?
Yeah, I want to thank the team for this body of work. I think it's super helpful and will be used and reflected on in many ways, which you may not want the conversation to go here right now, TJ, but where my head is at now is curious about the most obvious and immediate ways in which PSD and or ANR and or the Climate Council are planning to work with this body of knowledge now that it exists. And that may be not a viable thing to discuss right now, but that's really where my head's moving. And related to that, I think I recall in a fairly recent subcommittee meeting, or maybe it was a task group, the thermal review task group meeting, reference to a sort of key takeaways document or internal memo that I think maybe ANR was working on. And I'm just curious if my memory about that's correct, and if such a effort is intended or underway, and if so, if part of that might almost even be, I don't know how to articulate this well right now, but the concept of conclusions to not reach from this work, things that you might think this work is saying, but we really that's not the correct way to link those two findings. I mean, for example, some of the verbal comments that Jared has made today are in a way doing that for us, and it strikes me that this body of work could be misunderstood unintentionally, and therefore not have as positive and useful an impact as we would want for people who aren't as deep into this, and might mistakenly grab a sentence or two, that's talking about costs, but not also understand you need to talk about the benefits as well. That's a very simplistic example of what I'm talking about, but that's what I wanted to share at this point.
I think that's a challenge with any report, is the cherry picking of information one way or the other, right? And I think that has happened with Climate Council reports that have been done in the past, department reports, ANR, and so I think it's just incumbent upon everybody to try and present the the balance of what is in the report. and be true to that. I think as far as using the report, I let others comment as well, but I think you know, the business as usual update has already started to be kind of used, I think, in internal analyses from the department at least. And so that kind of work has really been helpful to kind of understand, well, we have updated projections of what's going to happen in the business as usual, and then where's the remaining gap, and how do we go about it with additional policies. In terms of this policy analysis, I think, and others can correct me, I think it will be an input to the Public Utility Commission process as well, or at least information that was developed here. But I don't know if there's others that have thoughts on where exactly it's going to be used. David, I want to, if you don't mind, since we put 1 o'clock on the schedule for public comment, I want to see if there's anybody from the public that wants to comment, and then we'll come back to you. And I think Taylor had a comment circling back on something earlier. So I don't have the whole view of non-cameras here, people who aren't showing their camera. So is there anybody from the public that would like to comment? Okay, so seeing none, David, we can go to you.
Thanks, TJ. I think Taylor was ahead of me. Go ahead, Taylor.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I put a message into the chat because I wasn't sure how long we wanted to dwell on Jared's observation, or if we wanted to make room for others. But I think Jared, that's a very astute observation, and and the reaction that I guess I had was, Chris observed, I guess, that we've had to deal with averages, I guess, in the modeling, and that's true. But I wondered if at the end in 2050 and beyond, there's only so much room for fossil fuels in order to meet the targets anyways. And so I wondered whether the question of whether you displace more gas versus more oil is more of a question of timing, and would therefore affect essentially what costs come early versus what costs come later, and then that affects the net present value of these scenarios when you consider what the discount rate is, which is fairly low in this analysis. So I wondered whether that would sort of moderate the effect of deciding which fuels get displaced first or not. But then another thought that I had, just in terms of interpreting the results of the analysis that we did do, assuming the proportional reduction for a policy design standpoint, is that this could be considered a kind of an upper bound. I mean, you certainly wouldn't displace gas more than oil. Ideally, you would want to displace the more expensive fuels, or the more cost-effective ones first. And we have assumed proportionality, and so you could interpret this as sort of like an upper bound on what the cost might be. And if you rolled that in with an adjusted social cost of carbon, I think that would be kind of a powerful message. So I wanted to make those 2 points in response.
Thanks, Taylor. Dave.
Thanks, TJ. And Liz and David Hill, Energy Futures Group, thanks. This report's terrific. Appreciate the work you all have done. At the risk of being pedantic, I just want to go back to the point that Jared made earlier. I just want to be clear on what this subcommittee is going to do, what the minutes are going to reflect as far as the update to the social cost of carbon. There's a process, as you mentioned, TJ, going on at the Utility Commission. The Clean Heat Standard is going to go back across the street to the legislature for review, and making that clarification, I think, is going to be really important to folks understanding the overall analysis that's been done here.
Yeah, so I think that's I was kind of thinking of a message here, because when I when I read the climate action plan with one lens, it says plan for updating the social cost of carbon on a regular basis and the discount rate. And so does that mean the state of Vermont should just do that? Does that mean the council should do it and make a recommendation? You know, if there was a different federal administration, I don't know the answer here, by the way, but if there's a different federal administration and the discount or the social cost of carbon goes down again, like it did under the Trump administration, because of the values that were being used by the federal government, would folks just want the state to just take that number, or would there want to be a process to kind of actually update it? And so I try and think about it both ways, and I'm not sure, you know, if the state had just kind of, if the state used this higher number, maybe some folks would be happy and some folks wouldn't be happy. And same thing if the state just used a lower number, if that happened to be kind of the political context of the day. And so maybe, so, you know, what was used is what had been approved in the initial climate action plan. And I guess I'm not sure of what the right process is there for updating that and how it should be communicated. I'll stop there because it's kind of an open question.
Well, fair enough. I think it certainly could be acknowledged that this report that's coming out on this date is not using the accepted social cost of carbon that's available on this date.
Yeah, fair enough. Jared?
I do think that there's a timing issue here, right? Like the council decided or adopted on a social cost of carbon to use for its climate action plan in 2021. And that was what was available then. And the next climate action plan won't come until 2025. So to me, the question is, you know, for the reports and the analysis that happen in the intervening time, I think ideally we're using the most current and accepted federal standards, if not in the you know, central analysis, at least as a sensitivity, because those are very different figures. And to me, the question about, you know, who is in office at a certain time, you know, to me, it's not about the politics of it. It's about the quality and of the process and the facts and evidence and the quality of the analysis designed to arrive at a figure, which, you know, I think this EPA is doing a very careful, rigorous job. And in the previous administration, it wasn't that there was actually found to be a lower social cost of carbon. That was a politically directed finding by the Trump administration. So I think that the goal should be to have high-level quality numbers and analysis that are the latest coming out of rigorous, trusted scientific processes, and not be using politically motivated numbers. I know that's not what you're suggesting.
Yeah, I agree. That's actually what I was trying to avoid. And I'm not saying that any numbers that we're talking about are politically motivated, but I think I agree with you that the past ones were. And so if that number switched because of a change of administration, and then we just adopted it because that was the number, and we're just following the most current number published, then we would have different issues. And so I just wanted to, I guess reflecting that maybe that I'm a bureaucrat and state government and process is, important, but David, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. It's an important discussion, and we didn't in the analysis, for the state of Vermont necessarily adopt the newer values, but just reflected that, yes, we're using the ones that were adopted by the Climate Council for the past. But I also want to emphasize too that the additional costs that are associated with the older social cost of carbon in the context of the energy spending and those types of things, I also think that result is not I understand that sometimes publicly it can be, this is an additional cost perspective, but it's not out of, this is meeting the GWSA requirements, and it's not, by my view, it is, it's not a large number. If you're talking about 1% to 2.5%, granted, then if you increase, and there may be continued debate about what the level of social cost of carbon could be, or whether it would change back and forth. But even if you're using the lower value too, these additional costs in terms of Vermont's energy spending are not that large. So I wanted to make that point.
Yeah, thank you for that, David. I mean, when I looked at those customer economics tabs, I saw, and this maybe reflects on a little bit of what Jared brought up too. It seemed like, only for propane customers and for low income fuel oil customers was there a customer benefit of making the switch. And so I guess that emphasizes one where maybe we should be prioritizing, avoiding or prioritizing propane customers, perhaps, but also that the majority of Vermonters will see increased operational costs because of a lot of these policies, and that's a trade-off. That's usually the trade-off that we are dealing with. Societal benefit for increased rate pressure, and how much does Vermont pay for societal benefit, and that is the question we need to balance, and that's where different people place different emphasis on things. But I think that's all it's the crux of the question. And Christine, you asked how this report will get used. I think that ultimately in the legislative session, whether it's this year or next year, that'll help. It'll inform the information behind this report will help inform those conversations. All right, so it's 1:16, and I think we're actually right on time, miraculously. Thank you again, David, Liz, and Chris, the Energy Futures Group team, Taylor, for all the work you do on the LEAP modeling and supporting that. And I think we're ready to transition to the transportation working group update and proposal. And so I think that means I'm turning it to you, Brad.
Thank you. And I actually don't know if either Transportation Working Group's proposal or the proposed edits were circulated or not.
I believe
the proposal was embedded in the agenda and posted on the website. So folks have that, and Jane just put it in the chat as well.
Great. So we are addressing the fact that the original climate action plan, the council had adopted a recommendation to include a cap and invest program for transportation to achieve transportation's legislatively required emission reductions. And a few weeks prior to the deadline for the climate action plan, the particular recommended cap and invest program, the Transportation Climate Initiative program, became non-viable. So we added an addendum to the climate action plan, noting that we only knew of two possible ways to achieve the needed reductions, which were cap and invest or a performance standard for transportation fuels. and the commitment to further research and pursue and come up with a recommended replacement for TCIP. That then intersected with the carbon reduction strategy, the federal funds that supported and required the carbon reduction strategy. So we held separate work on transportation while the carbon reduction strategy was created. And that arrived a couple of weeks ago. And the carbon reduction strategy, even kind of fully implemented with some supplemental programs, doesn't fully achieve the reduction in transportation emissions required by the law in order to hit our goals. So we are now looking to fill the gap in needed reductions between what the carbon reduction strategy will deliver and what the goals are. And it remains true that we are only aware of two ways to achieve that. The carbon reduction strategy did say that of the additional programs, a cap and invest and/or clean transportation standard programs are likely the two most promising options to close the gap in projection emissions versus required emissions level for the transportation sector, in addition to the advanced clean fleet standard. So, everyone who's looking at this is pretty consistent that there's, as far as we know, there are two ways to get there. And if we look specifically at other potential cap and invest programs, there are two which Vermont could possibly join. One is the Western Climate Initiative, which has a transportation carbon marketplace and is up and running. And the other is New York's new cap and invest program, which is economy-wide. And our recommendation, the Transportation Working Group's recommendation now, is that we engage an independent entity to do the analysis of what it would mean if Vermont were to join the Western Climate Initiative, what it would mean if Vermont were to join New York's program, and what a clean transportation standard or a performance standard would also mean as a complement to one of those programs. And I'll say Cap and Invest remains our leading candidate for the same reasons that it was 3 years ago, in terms of being the most cost-effective way and a way that the program can be designed with social justice in mind, and kind of the highest likelihood of success of reducing emissions in the transportation sector in the way we want. So, I said earlier that having the analysis done by someone independent of us all in our various roles is important. Again, as we discussed earlier, we do want to make sure that we're following the science and the data and ending up with the best recommendation, whether or not we like it. So we are recommending that it be an independent consultant funded separately through the legislature. And New York is standing their program up. There are various ways we can interact with them. Our recommendation is that Vermont join as a formal observer to the New York Cap and Invest program. And this work, as is our mandate and our practice, is must be carried out in parallel with public outreach and our fellow Vermonters having an opportunity to understand what we're doing and to comment on it and to suggest ways to make it better. And in terms of the next couple of steps in this conversation, I see Christine has a question, which is great. I guess with the climate office leading, the administration folks had some suggested changes, which we can hear from them on which they're sort of a number of smaller ones and formatting ones and a couple of big ones. And those two big ones are probably ones that we want to discuss at length. But first, before Christine's virtual arm gets tired from holding her hand up so long.
Great, thank you. I read the memo last night. I really appreciate being able to link into stuff before the meeting. Although it's helpful having it in the link during the chat during the meeting. And I thought the memo was extremely well done, very specific yet concise, very clear, and I strongly support all 4 of the recommendations. And I think it's important that we get this work done, applied to Vermont ASAP. And because we've kind of known these have been the options for a while, so we're just burning time here unnecessarily, in my view. But let's get this thing going, and I'd be interested to know what other proposed changes are being suggested, because I only know what I read in the memo last night.
All right. Well, let's then go. The sort of 2 changes, which the 2 recommended changes on the marked up draft that struck me as most significant are the elimination of point number 2, which is that the legislature appropriate funding for an independent consultant to do the analysis and deliver a policy recommendation, a specific policy recommendation by a year from tomorrow, December 1st, 2024. Let's tackle that one. And whoever felt most strongly that should be eliminated, do you want to explain why you are recommending that deletion?
Can I just maybe frame all of the comments and then we can jump into the...
Sure.
Yeah. You mentioned some sort of minor language changes. Yeah, we had some sort of general language changes that we'd like to see that sort of take away some subjectivity of some of the language and help to align some of the language with the carbon reduction strategy a little bit better. Like you said, that's pretty minor. We had some suggestions for a couple more bullet items in the technical analysis around the economic benefits and costs to Vermonters, as well as the estimates for administrative costs to get a policy recommendation in. You mentioned removal of the recommendation for engagement with the legislature. We just made a suggestion to wrap the stakeholder process, recommendation number 4, into recommendation number 1.
Yeah.
And then we question really the need for the recommendation for to become a formal observer in New York's process. Sort of given what is in the first recommendation and talking about New York's program and what might come of that, because it is mentioned in number 1. And then also potentially just aligning it a little bit better with the carbon reduction strategy language that isn't necessarily becoming a formal observer, but just learning more about what New York is doing. And again, that probably occurring through the first recommendation anyway. So that's sort of the high level summary of that. I don't know, Megan or Jane or anybody else, if you have any other anything else you want to add, maybe get into more detail about, is it recommendation 3?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So I think we were wondering about the component of the recommendation for further analysis in terms of a independent consultant. It sounds like, you know, through the legislature and to be administered by JFO, and would propose that that analysis be administered through the state agencies. And the reason for that being that we have already established you know, meaningful relationships with our colleagues in New York, DC and NYSERDA, and then also the jurisdictions that participate in the Western Climate Initiative. And so we have the ability to engage directly with the you know, the regulators and the program designers, and understand the analysis that they've already undergone in relation to their programs and their program design, and use that to directly inform the questions that we would ask in conducting such an analysis. And so we feel like that gives us a pretty, you know, strong leg up in terms of you know, really informing the analysis and asking the right questions, understanding that we have a direct line to those programs already. And then also just because, you know, we have extensive experience in participating directly in these types of analyses in the past. As you know, we participate in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and you know, ANR participates directly in the periodic program review that is conducted in relation to that program, wherein we conduct you know, a number of different modeling exercises in conjunction with the other jurisdictions that participate in that program. I think you're all familiar with the work that we did in relation to understanding the impacts and benefits of the Transportation Climate Initiative program, which was the Cap and Invest program for the transportation sector that was contemplated a handful of years ago by the Transportation Climate Initiative jurisdictions. So we're just very familiar with this space and feel that it would be appropriate to have that work, you know, come out, be led by state government. And in addition to the fact that, you know, that's the jurisdiction also currently lies there. So just wanted to offer that as an alternative to the option related to the independent analysis.
Got it. Thanks. And, you know, I probably should have said at the top that neither of our 2 co-chairs of the Transportation Working Group are able to be here today, neither Joey nor Gina. But I do know that the group thought it pretty important that this be done outside of the state agencies. And part of that is the fact that you know, I know that there's been some frustration with data not coming through to us and getting scrubbed and rearranged and so forth. So we were, as I said, hoping to avoid anyone having to do that, and you know, have a third party do and present. And Secretary Moore.
I just want to flag, Bram, that's a pretty serious accusation that the state agencies aren't acting appropriately, and would ask you to reconsider those remarks.
And I am at a bit of a disadvantage in Joey's absence with the specifics. But Jared, there was what was it recently?
There were very significant differences between the draft of the carbon reduction strategy that was delivered to the state by the consultant and specific recommendations that were in that draft that after it went through state review, were taken out and omitted from the final version. So I think that there is an interest in the Transportation Task Group and other members in making sure that independent analysis that is done gets fully passed along and is transparently and honestly provided, rather than having pieces taken out that may not politically align with the administration or the appointees behind it. I think that it is very important. The legislature has set forward a law to achieve legal obligations for emissions reduction. And given that this conversation keeps getting delayed, and all we keep doing is having, we were told that the carbon reduction strategy was going to result in analysis of different policy options for the transportation sector with a recommendation of what to do going forward. And while there was good work done in that carbon reduction strategy, we ended up at the exact same place where we were before, knowing that there was a gap between our legal obligations and what business as usual is expected to result in terms of emissions by 2030, and no pointing towards policy option that, and we know what these options are. We need to move forward with an analysis that results in a specific recommendation, rather than continuing to spin our wheels and have study after study that does not actually result in any forward meaningful policy action and movement. And I think that the recent record, unfortunately, of what we saw with the carbon reduction strategy and the significant differences between the drafts that were directly from the consultant and what the administration submitted are very concerning.
And Megan and Jane.
Yeah, just because we're coming off the heels of the buildings and thermal analysis, I do just want to, commend that we just had a presentation on a successful analysis that is analogous with the kind of analysis you're now asking of in the transportation space, that was led and coordinated by ANR and PSD. And we all acknowledge that that was a successful, unbiased scientific analysis that came out on behalf of led by state agencies. So I do just want to say that, the argument now feels counter to the presentation and discussion we just had that was led by state staff.
Agreed. That was a critique specific to the carbon reduction strategy, not to the thermal analysis.
So, we have a recommendation from the Transportation Working Group, and our goal for today is to come out with a recommendation that we as a cross-sector mitigation subcommittee can make to the whole council. And we've got to sort through, and thanks for posting a link to the track changes version with the suggested changes. We need to sort through these and get to something that we can vote on. So, and editing with a large group in real time is not the most effective process in the world. Dave.
Thank you, Bram. Yeah, and I don't have any editing suggestions. It sounds like what I'm about to talk with could shows up in number 1, I think number 3 recommendations here. But I would encourage ANR to participate in the activity that's taking place in New York at the moment. Formal, informal participation. I know that ANR representatives probably work with many of those folks there because it's probably a mix of air office people and transportation people. Reggie, of course, is air office people and energy people in both states. But I think if solutions come from that process, if Vermont decides that they look good to this state, then that informal participation and coordination will grease the skids and make it easier to coordinate and potentially join with that program if Vermont decides it wants to do that.
Thanks. And, that's, I think, exactly the goal, if it turns out that joining New York is the best thing for us to do, we want to be ready to do that when that becomes an available option. So moving this,
So
go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to just ask a process question here. I wonder, it was only 2 days ago, I think, that folks were first able to see the initial draft, and then the state team was able to make some edits today. So there hasn't been much time for people to look at these. I wonder if the right thing to do here is to, now that these have been introduced, to say this is going to be on the agenda for next month for further discussion and a vote, if that's what's called for. And I think that's a vote to bring it to the full council, I think. And I'm not sure the timing on this. So, I'll let folks respond, but just wondering if that process makes sense.
I think, yes, I think it does. And I'm also thinking, the Transportation Working Group had some members of the administration who, haven't been part of it in the last little bit of time. But maybe we can reconvene the full group and work out, get to a consensus draft for the whole subcommittee to contemplate.
Yeah, I think the timing challenge here is that there is a recommendation in here for the legislature, and the legislature is going to reconvene in early January, and they're going to have a lot on their plate. And so my worry, I think that, it's unfortunate. There were multiple attempts to involve members of the state team in the transportation task group, and either chose not to or were told not to participate. I don't know why. So we could have had these conversations in the task group to be bringing a consensus document, but that participation did not happen. At this point, I would be most comfortable. I feel like this issue needs to go before the council at its next meeting to have a chance to be before the legislature with a timing that it could actually be acted upon. So I think my recommendation, I don't know if this is feasible or works, would be to ask the subcommittee to approve the memo as drafted, with the exception that if we're able to hold another transportation task group, to deputize the transportation task group to make edits to this proposal, if we can actually then meet and talk through these, getting edits on the proposal, right before the meeting or during the meeting doesn't give us the ability to work through them. And my worry is that the end effect is just further delay in terms of being able to communicate with the legislature about a way forward, so we don't lose another year and an opportunity to get actual directed policy recommendations that would be ready, not this year, but by the start of the next session. Because we've been spinning our wheels, and it's felt like a bad Groundhog Day movie for 3 years now on transportation policy recommendations.
And I do believe it is true that cross-sector does not meet again before the council meets on the 18th, right?
Well, we could change that, couldn't we? I mean, there was a period when we were meeting every 2 weeks religiously. And sometimes a lot of activity in between. This seems like a very important moment, and at least for myself, I'd like to propose something like this, a slight adaptation from what Jared just proposed. I would be much more, I've reviewed the edits in the document while we've been talking quickly, and some of the edits I think are fine, but clearly this question of who's commissioning the work and overseeing the work has got some pretty divergent points of view right now on the people on this call. And I would prefer to have, provide another week or 2 weeks max to see if more of a consensus document could come forward that is an attempt to address the concerns on a number of different sides that have been articulated today, in addition to it in integrating the editorial edits, many of which I think strengthen the document, before cross-sector is asked to vote on it. I would personally be more comfortable with that. And then if that isn't possible and doesn't happen within 2 weeks, if we can, let's set our meeting and we'll work with whatever the most recent document is in 2 weeks at cross-sector and vote on it then. That would be my suggestion.
TJ, as chair, what are your thoughts about reconvening cross-sector before the 18th?
Well, I like that idea better than having a vote today. There's, only 7 members of the committee here, or maybe 8 now, to start with, and a much bigger committee. And I do think there's opportunity to kind of narrow any issues. My understanding was that the December council meeting was a really full agenda. Is this even going to be taken up in that meeting?
We had spoken at the steering committee about extending the length of the meeting to enable this to come up if a recommendation comes from cross-sector. So I think it does make sense to try to schedule, and have an additional cross-sector meeting so a recommendation can come forward given the timing concerns.
Yeah.
Bram,
just kind of feels like we're circling around an agreement that the working group should get together. The authors of the edit that recommended changes, and see if we can put together a consensus version, or I can imagine that we will end up with consensus on a lot of stuff, but not on probably that one big issue of who's going to oversee and administer. But we could then at cross-sector have a vote on two drafts, and see which the subcommittee wants to adopt. At worst, at least that way we sort of get everyone's opinion and everyone has time to study the drafts, and we will have something to present to the council on the 18th, sort of whichever way we go.
Anybody else want to comment on the proposal?
Yeah, I do think that there are some suggestions in the edits around kind of the components of the analysis when looking at the 2 cap and invest options and the other policy options that are, I think are good and would be friendly amendments. And so I do think that there's a way to get, even if we can't get complete agreement, to incorporate some of those suggestions and get closer rather than rushing it. But I do think that means that we need to move quickly to reconvene the transportation task group to kind of walk through those proposed edits, see where we have agreement versus disagreement, and then have a cross-sector subcommittee call additional meeting within the next week or 2 to vote on a final version of those to be able to go before the council.
Yeah, from my point of view, if we are going to meet again between now and the 18th, I will come to that meeting prepared to vote on whatever the transportation work group has recommended, unless I find something in it that I object to. And whoever has concerns about the document between now and then, I hope you all work together and come up with something that you all support. And I'm coming prepared to vote based on what the work group recommends in the amended version, or if you're going to give me two versions, I'll read them both and vote whichever way I want to vote. So that's how I'm hearing this conversation. And I don't want to not have a chance to vote before the Climate Council meeting.
So the Climate Council meetings on the 18th. Is the 14th too late? It keeps our kind of a quote unquote normal Thursday spot. We had a meeting scheduled for the 21st, but if moving it up to the 14th, I don't know if that gives enough time in preparation for the Climate Council itself, which I think is the following Monday.
Well, I think for our Climate Council process, we are planning to present the cross sectors transportation recommendation on the 18th for a vote by the whole council in the January meeting.
Yes, that's right, Graham, which is, yes. Which gives me a little more confidence, only because, just as a reminder, there are significant new members of the council. This will be their first meeting, and we've been trying to get them up to speed on the biomass conversation with background materials and prep, but to prep them to get up to speed on all the transportation conversation is a lot too. So I do think presenting it and following the governance document and sharing it at the December meeting is in line with what the steering committee and you all have said this process.
Right. So I guess my question was, is the 14th, is there ability to get materials in front of the Climate Council in time, given process updates, if we met on the 14th, or do we need to meet sooner than that?
So TJ, I'd be happy to send out a when to meet poll to the subcommittee to see when we can get the most counselors, looking at maybe the beginning of that week, so that it gives the Climate Council a couple extra days to digest a proposal if one is agreed upon. And then the smaller task group folks can try to meet next week to discuss the proposal in more detail. Does that seem reasonable to folks? So it gives the task group a week to do their work, and then we could try to reconvene the subcommittee at the beginning, at the first few days, the week of the 11th, and I'll try to find a time that gets us a quorum, if not better.
Okay.
Yep, that sounds good to me.
Okay.
Andrea?
Hi, yeah, thanks. I just wanted to have an opportunity to respond to the comments from Bram and Jared on the carbon reduction strategy. And I think it has some bearing on this conversation about, I forget if it's the third recommendation or which one it is, but might help us move forward. And I just want to, we talk about Groundhog Day. I just want to note that the carbon reduction strategy did get us further in understanding what gap needed to be filled. It will definitely provide a better understanding and a foundation for any program design that we move forward with or analysis that we do. We know the gap. We know when we could meet, or we would be projected to meet, the 2030 target, where before we might not have. We did do analysis on the policy recommendations, and the technical committee and the advisory committee together at the June meeting decided that we shouldn't move forward with providing that information, because for the same reason that Christine mentioned before for the thermal, putting some information out there can sometimes be dangerous in the wrong hands. And the carbon reduction strategy was never going to design a cap and invest. It was going to provide some, analyses towards that. And the committee, from which a lot of people on this committee were part of, the technical committee and the advisory committee, decided it wasn't good to put that information out there. The other point I want to make is that the version of the carbon reduction strategy that was shared with the technical committee And the advisory committee in September, late September, was very light on any additional recommendations, if you recall. And so we went back to the consultant and we fleshed out the additional policies sections a lot. And as with any document that a consultant is doing for an entity, we're going to go back and forth on versions. And that's what we did. So it provides a lot more detail than it did the last version that either the technical committee or the advisory committee saw. So I just wanted to make sure that is clear to everybody based on the comments that were provided by Jared and Bram earlier.
Thank you, Andrea. Jared, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea, and thanks, TJ. I'm happy to be very specific about what I'm talking about because it relates directly to this recommendation. The draft carbon reduction strategy that was provided by Cambridge Systematics to the task group, to the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, and I quote, said, "It is therefore highly likely that the state will need to implement additional programs, including a clean transportation standard and/or cap and invest program to entirely close the gap between projected and required emissions." That language is no longer in there. What I saw in the difference between the draft and the final wasn't additional information, although I'm sure there was some additional information. It was a taking out of specific recommendations that we already knew to be true, and that actually in their verbal presentation of their report, Cambridge Systematics underlined the likely necessity of those type of programs in terms of having confidence that we could achieve the legal obligations, because the modeling and the other programs looked at could not do it on their own. And so that's very specifically what I'm talking about. And regardless of that point, we need to get to a point where we're actually doing the pros, the cons, the key considerations of the real policy options so that we can make a policy recommendation, whether that's for the next year in the legislature or in the 2025 climate action plan. It is untenable to continue to not have a full policy set of meaningful policy options to meet our legal obligations, both overall and specific to the transportation sector. And we don't have it yet. And the solution can't just be to continue punting or delaying or studying and making marginal progress, but continuing to say the same thing over and over again, which is we know we have a gap and business as usual is not going to get us there. So we need these type of policy solutions.
Yeah, and the carbon reduction strategy does say that as well. Bram quoted
it took out the language around cap and invest and clean transportation standard between the draft and the final.
Okay, I'm not going to argue back and forth with you right now, but Bram actually just quoted the carbon reduction strategy as submitted to Federal Highway earlier, and cap and invest and a clean transportation standard are in there.
So I just want to remind folks that you know, the state folks who are engaging in these analyses, you're kind of looking at a lot of them here, whether it's me or Andrea or Megan or Brian, right? And you know, these kinds of conversations with consultants happen. We're experts too, and so what we say when we get a report from a consultant is, hey, can you really draw that conclusion from this data? Is that really a true statement? And the consultant may say, hey, you know what, you're right. And so I want to re-emphasize the encouragement to be really careful when you're questioning the integrity of state, my colleagues at the state, and this people who are doing this work, who really, one, are experts, and two, are really, in my experience, really driven to have fact-based, objective information out there. And so I can't count how many times I've said, can you really put this kind of emphasis and say that, the word significant, or this will happen, or, and then consultants say, well, yeah, you're right. Like we can't say this definitely will happen, or we can't say, and, we make suggestions that don't happen either, and or we maybe we can draw these assumptions or draw these conclusions from something. So especially in even more so in like the public context that is this climate council meeting, and calling into question the integrity of the staff that are working really hard and frankly overworked in a lot of cases to try and move the ball forward. I think just be careful about doing that, please.
Yeah, and let me say that I don't question anyone's integrity, honesty, good intentions, expertise, or hard work. But it is clear that the administration has a set of beliefs and a set of policies which I think from time to time really feels like it is constraining the conversation and constraining the recommendations. And, to avoid having people put into that position of having to follow a set of values and policies that are in place in the administration, which is completely appropriate, but it does feel as though we as a group, if there are people independent analysis happening, it avoids those potential constraints. And I did not mean to say or imply anything more than that, and I apologize if I did.
Yeah, I'll say maybe. I mean, there's like an elephant in the room. I mean, we hired the consultant that designed the clean heat standard to evaluate the policies of the clean heat standard, policy options, and that was presented here today. I think that's a convenient narrative that the administration is putting the thumb on the scale somehow. In my experience at the Department of Public Service, we get the information, and there's a range of possible outcomes. None of us know the future, and that's where the politics and the consequences of elections come in, is on the emphasis that you place on those objective results and within the range of possible outcomes. And that, I think, is all fair, right? And so, I guess I'll leave it at that, in that, there's, for every example that you could come up with of maybe something happening, I think I could come up with an alternative example of it happening in another direction with analysis. And there's just no need to do that, because they're all in the range of possible outcomes, and it's emphasis, and where you place emphasis, and that comes from the consequences of elections, and that goes from both the top at the governor level and the administration, and then the legislature is a much different body, right? And so that's the process, and let's just work within that process without kind of perpetuating an unhelpful narrative that people are trying to hide the ball. So sorry to be on my soapbox a little bit there, but I know that the teams that work for the state work really hard. So I don't know, I blew past any time for public comment. It looks like there's only 1 or 2 folks here. Does anybody have any public comment while we're still on the line? Okay. So Megan will put out a poll for folks to meet again. So probably sometime the week of the 11th, maybe perhaps a day or 2 before that, the end of the previous week. And then we'll go for there on the transportation sector. I think maybe just an hour meeting, but we'll think about that with the poll. But we covered a lot of ground today. Thank you all. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.